So my name is Gene Bergman, and I am the president of the board of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Burlington here, and also a co-facilitator of our Economic Justice Task Force. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our house, which is 200 years old this year and is the oldest surviving place of worship in the entire city of Burlington. All right. And I see a lot of you who are not Unitarian Universalists, but I do see a lot of UUs. And could I have some of you just raise your names, raise your hands, who are UUs? This is an amazing society, and you can learn more by talking to the folks that raise their hands. We've got information in the pews, but I just want to again welcome you to our house. Our bicentennial theme has been from our house to the world, and this reflects a history of hosting prophetic voices in this meeting house. On the eve of the Civil War, our minister here, Joshua Young, presided over John Brown's funeral when no other minister would. And this house has been a sanctuary in many times of crisis, current and past, and was the birthplace of Planned Parenthood of Northern New England and the Peace and Justice Center. We've hosted prophetic voices, Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, Bill McKibben, Emma's Revolution has sung from this pulpit, Al Sharpton and the Daughters of Malcolm X and Jackie Robinson. And now, another prophetic voice, Amy Goodman. We're honored to have you in our house, and honored to have the Peace and Justice Center with us, and welcome. And so will you all join me in welcoming Beverly Little Thunder, who is the chair of the Peace and Justice Center's board, to introduce Amy. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really honored to have been asked to do this. The Peace and Justice Center has been in this community for over 35 years, and we've been working for racial and social justice in a vast amount of areas here in Burlington and in Vermont. We're trying to create change little at a time, and all of you are helping by being here tonight. We're a nonprofit, and we depend on our membership dues to support the work that we do. So if you are not already a member, consider becoming a member by just stopping at our table in the back, and you can be guided into becoming a member. And if you have been a member and you've let your membership lapse, right now is a good time to renew that. We welcome new members always, and there's never anyone turned away for lack of funds. So if you want to become a member and you don't have the money right now, please stop at the table and talk to one of our representatives there. One of the things that we all can do is do something little to create change in our community. Becoming a member of Peace and Justice and supporting that work is one of those little ways that we can all contribute to the work that needs to be done, not only in our state, but across the country. And so, again, I ask you to really consider that. One of the things that we put out each month is a little list of some of the things that we're doing. And I just wanted to bring to your attention a couple of upcoming events that your support, your presence could really make a big difference at. On Saturday in Montpelier, from 1 to 4, the People's Climate March is happening. And I hope that all of you will find your way there to support this, to let our voices be heard. When people gather together in mass like that, it does make a difference. It does make a difference. On Monday, on May 1st, May Day, they're going to have a May Day march for dignity. And it's for the migrant justice workers who are asking Ben & Jerry's to honor what they said they were going to do 2 years ago. So they're going to meet at the Migrant Justice Vermont Workers Center on North Winooski at 12 o'clock, and they're leaving at 1 o'clock sharp to march through the Old North End to Ben & Jerry's Scoop Shop to demand that they implement the Milk with Dignity program. And they promised that 2 years ago. So I think that we should all be there to remind them that a promise is a promise, and they should honor that. And then if you have nothing to do on May 4th, from 11 to 12, May 4th from 5:30 to 8, there's going to be a Stand Against Racism community reading of the Martin Luther King speech, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. And that's happening at Arts Riot in Burlington. It's going to have dinner and a cash bar and a live reading and dessert. And they're asking a $15 donation because this is a fundraiser. And it sounds like it could be a lot of fun. I'm hoping to go, and I hope that I see a lot of you there. All of you should have received one of these little pamphlets on your seat. It lists everything that we have upcoming for this month. And if you didn't get one, I'm sure you can pick one up at the back table. I am Lakota, and I'm from Standing Rock, North Dakota. I witnessed this woman get arrested for showing support and supporting the truth about the aggression of the Morton County Police against peaceful water protectors. Standing Rock was a wake-up call for how easy it is for our rights to be violated. For journalists, freedom of speech and reporting are crucial to keeping us informed. As we have heard her on Democracy Now, addressing difficult issues with honesty and bluntly, we can only support the rights and freedoms of our press. 10 years ago, in the same space, we were honored to hear this woman here in this building. PJC sponsored that event as well. So it's with great honor and respect that I present our esteemed guest, Amy Goodman. Thank you.
Well, what an honor to be here, and what an honor that introduction was. But let me introduce my colleagues, friends, and family first, and say how appreciative we are to be here at the Unitarian Universalist Society, and I'm going to talk more about that in a few moments, and the special folks that are here tonight. But I'd first like to introduce my colleague and friend and co-author, Denis Moynihan, who hails from this very city, and my brother, David Goodman, a stalwart, wonderful writer, journalist, and co-author of our book as well, Democracy Now! 20 Years Covering the Movements changing America. It's really great to be here.
Thanks very much. As Amy said, I spent formative early years in Burlington, certainly born in a less progressive state just to the east of here, but I came here, we were driving up here and I saw, oh my God, that's where I have my first memory. It was down at what used to be called the Rotary Drugstore, and my sister always looking out for us was telling me not to cross the street. So that was long ago, and I've made it this far, and it's great to be back in Burlington. The mention of the event on May 4th also reminded me it was my 5th birthday, May 4th. I was probably being socialized by playing some kind of war game or something, or some violent game that kids certainly back then were encouraged to play. And that was on my 5th birthday was the day of Kent State. So it just kind of brings back to me the importance of communities like you have clearly built here over the decades. And the Peace and Justice Center, I want to thank you for organizing this event, and the Unitarian Church for welcoming Amy, her brother, and me, and all of us here tonight. I often tell my mother, we used to go to one of the Catholic churches up in the New North End where we lived, but I became a fallen Catholic very early. And it's on tours like this with Amy when we're crisscrossing the country nonstop that I actually do like a year's worth of church attendance or a decade's worth. More often than not in a Unitarian church, I have to say. It's no accident that when I did finally get married, it was through a friend of mine from college who had become a Unitarian minister. So it was, it's great to be here. As Catholics, we're trained to make confessions, and I'm just too close to the scene of one of my first acts of vandalism to not apologize. I doubt the Nate, who used to own Nate's Men's Shop across the street, is here tonight, but my mother always reminds me that when I was a toddler, I went into the display window on Nate's, which was, I think, someone correct me if I'm wrong, one of the first stores on the corner here, and knocked over all the mannequins. I hope that my acts of defiance have become more constructive, but that was an early episode, and then with friends, did have a police encounter in the New North End around kindergarten age with involved some broken bottles. But I really have cleaned up my act slightly. And working with Amy for 16 or 17 years at Democracy Now! Has been a real honor for me, a life-changing experience. And it's just opened up so many experiences to see her conduct this journalism in the field. As we just heard, the reporting from Standing Rock, the what they refer to as tribal treaty lands, right? It was actually on land that is considered legally private property, where they were, where the dogs were unleashed on those people that Amy and the team of us documented. But really, the Lakota Nation, where we went to document this really incredible resistance, multi-generational, so many different people coming to support that. And that was one instance of the courage that I've witnessed, Amy. The first time I heard Democracy Now! Was the first summer that it was broadcast, 1996. And I was working as a caretaker of an island off the coast of Maine, about 6 miles offshore, and had no access to any kind of digital technology, just had a radio. And the daily broadcast of Democracy Now! Was a real connection to what was happening in the world as I was laboring then for the family of Buckminster Fuller, who owned that island. And it was inspirational to see the legacy of his work, and it's not the most remunerative occupation, but certainly peaceful to be out there with the SEALs on one of those islands. And later, 1999, I was participated in some organizing around the battle, in what became known as the Battle of Seattle, the shutdown of the WTO. In my role, a few of us, many people were engaged in blockading the streets and engaged in creative actions that brought attention to that particular global trade treaty, and no one in the direct action community really wanted to spend time interfacing with the media, because the media, everyone thought, would just do a horrible job reporting on the protests, would minimize the acts of resistance and get it all wrong, and as often happens. But a few of us said, no, we have to make an effort, so we made a small team to interface with the press. And certainly the press largely did a horrible job reporting on the protests at the WTO. But there were exceptions, and it was with primarily in meeting Amy and Jeremy Scahill and Juan Gonzalez, a small team from Democracy Now! That came that really did a great job of letting the world know what is this complex trade organization, the WTO, and why are 50,000 people in the streets suffering tremendous brutality at the hands of police. Regular listeners of Democracy Now!, long-term listeners remember that reporting, but it's more recently the police chief of Seattle then, Norm Stamper, has become a regular guest on Democracy Now! As an ex-police chief. He actually lost his job immediately after the protest, but has since become a leading voice for police reform and drug legalization. But he was behind that police riot that Amy reported on and that we were suffering in the streets. A couple years later, I was helping organize the clemency campaign for Leonard Peltier, an effort to gain freedom for that activist. He, as well, from Pine Ridge and a member of the American Indian movement. And Leonard was asking Bill Clinton for clemency, and we know Bill Clinton quite notoriously abused his power of executive clemency by freeing fugitive financiers and cronies of his family. But it was, Leonard remained in prison. It was after that, certainly the community media in New York City helped organize that December 10th, 2000 march that I was involved with. It was the largest march ever held for Leonard Peltier. And he remains in federal prison to this day. And I know that he has a strong base of support in the peace and justice community here in Vermont. But after the denial of clemency, I went out to Lawrence, Kansas to help run his office because the people that were holding down the campaign were completely and understandably burnt out. And in the 6 months I spent there, I was speaking with Leonard on the phone every morning, visiting him in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary every week, and trying to keep the lights on at the campaign and figure out next steps. But in the conversations I would have with him every morning at around 7:30 or 8 in the morning, he would get access to a telephone before being forced to go work in the prison slave labor industry, making furniture for a company called Unicor. And in those conversations that we had those mornings, the first thing that Leonard would say to me is, "Did you hear Democracy Now! This morning?" Because there was community radio station KKFI out of Kansas City broadcast the show at 7 a.m. every morning. And there was a recreation period in the yard at Leavenworth, and Leonard would say that the warden had restricted the size of radios that were available, so a tiny transistor radio. And Leonard would say, "Yeah, me and a bunch of brothers gather around the radio and listen to Democracy Now! Every morning, and it was their lifeline, their link, especially in that kind of extremely repressive environment with limited access to even print material, let alone the internet. So Democracy Now! Was important, is important to those people incarcerated. More than 2 million people we have in prison have very limited access. And so I was very glad that Leonard had access to the program and the other offerings of KKFI. It was when we started broadcasting television and with the digital distribution of the show that it gets into even farther around the world. And we got a request from an administrator of a prison educational system in the United Kingdom. He said, I run all these programs. We have a closed-circuit TV system in our prisons, and we'd like to run Democracy Now! Every day. And can I have permission? We're like, oh, by all means, you can run it as much as you want. So they started downloading the program and running it on their TV system in the prison. And a year later, they got in touch with us and said, we just wanted you to know that we've had the show on for a year, and we've seen an increase in prisoner participation in our educational opportunities, 50% increase. And when we poll the prisoners and ask them why they're signing up for a particular class or activity, they say almost universally it's because they were inspired by something they heard on Democracy Now! So when I often say, we travel around. This event is being recorded and live streamed by CCTV, and also with RETN, and you have a pretty innovative, groundbreaking municipal telecom system in Burlington that we've reported on, and has carried Democracy Now! And we're very honored that Democracy Now! Is carried on Vermont PBS, and we're producing our shows from their studios while we're here in town. But when you're supporting independent media with financial contributions or making sure that the elected officials maintain the strength and vitality and support policies that support public access stations like CCTV, you're not only doing it for yourself, for the content that it brings you, for the opportunities, but you're also doing it for those people, the most vulnerable in our society, those in prison who don't have access to all the smartphones and limitless data that we have access to. So thank you to all of you who supported independent media, who support outlets like CCTV. You really have a pretty, I'd have to say, stellar, CCTV and RETN have a great reputation nationally, and so it's always great. It was no surprise that when people were seeking to dig up dirt on Senator Sanders, CCTV had a really ample archive of interviews from the 80s from then Mayor Sanders, and it didn't work, obviously, but it nevertheless, it's a testament to the good work that they've been doing for decades. So thanks to them and for streaming tonight. I've gone beyond my allotted time, but I'm really honored to have written the book with these two siblings. David Goodman is an inspiration. He, in addition to co-writing books with Amy, has written the absolute Bible on backcountry skiing in the Northeast. I'm sure many of you have avoided getting lost in the backcountry, maybe, but with one of David's books. As we wrote the book, he was doing multiple roles, certainly supporting his wife, Sue Minter, who's here tonight. And I want to thank Sue. He has, I'm sure, more to say about Sue, but Sue has been a stalwart friend and supporter, and it's her presence here tonight is just a reminder that we have a lot of work to do purging the nefarious influence of dirty money in our democracy. So here's David.
As before we launch out into the rest of the world, one of the really nice things for me, since I live just down the road in Waterbury, is that my family gets to see this one time, and this is when we authors get to thank the real force behind how we get these things done, and that is to thank my wife, Sioux Minter, whose tenacity, courage, and vision this past year in carrying the torch for so many of us has inspired me to do what she has done, trying to make the world better. And so, thank you, Sue. And it's also customary for authors to apologize for their spouses or partners for being so busy, but Sue, I recall you being pretty busy this past year, so I think we're even. 20 years ago, my sister came home to the family, as she often would, to announce very excitedly her new project. She had a lot of projects. At that time, she was the news director at WBAI in New York, one of the 5 Pacifica radio stations around the country, one of the largest community media stations in the country. Amy told us that this was something different for Pacifica. They were going to host an election show. It was 1996, and it was the re-election campaign of President Bill Clinton, and they were going to wade in where only the pundits and the networks had gone before and do a daily news hour on the radio that would bring not the voices from the corporate suites, but the voices from the streets. The name of the show would be Democracy Now! And of course, Amy always wanted her family's input and perhaps approval. I don't know if that was really part of the bill, but so I gave it to her. Democracy Now? That's the name of your show? Who's going to listen to something called Democracy Now? Why don't you just call it, you got to do this by stealth. Let people ease them in, the election hour, or chit-chats with Amy, or just fly under the radar, But no, we discovered then something that we have known, and you have all gotten to experience, which was Amy's tendency to buck conventional wisdom. And in this case, even her family's wisdom. And I'm so glad that she did, because 20 years later, this show called Democracy Now! Seems to have generated just a little interest. It's gone from 9 stations in 1996 to over 1,400 stations on TV, radio, around the world, and millions who listen on the internet. So yeah, here's to Democracy Now! Amy and I are the grandchildren of refugees, immigrants who came to this country, Jews who fled pogroms, those were lynchings, in Russia and Poland in the 1920s. And were it not when they arrived sailing past the Statue of Liberty, which holds its hand high with a torch that lights the way, that welcomes those fleeing conflict or whatever their situation may be in their home. They arrived scared, and they changed their names as they were registered at Ellis Island so as not to seem too ethnic. My maternal grandparents went from Bakalchuk to Bak, all these little things that refugees do to integrate, to somehow be there. And they were lucky to come to a country that welcomed them. And at these times, where we now have witch hunts against immigrants and refugees, I am reminded that were it not for the welcome that my grandparents, our grandparents received, we would not be here. And it's perhaps no coincidence that the motto of Democracy Now! Is that Statue of Liberty, but holding a microphone, where the media becomes the way to shine the light and to welcome people and to let them know that their voice will be included and will be heard. So how was it that Democracy Now!, this 8-month experiment, it was supposed to end after the 1996 election, like the day after or the week after, is still with us? Well, it turns out that we have the corporate media to thank for that. The corporate media, which has become cheerleaders and megaphones for those in power. And we certainly saw the consequences of that during the Iraq War, among other instances, where had it not been for a corporate media that acted as a conveyor belt for the lies of the Bush administration, we might not have had a war. And we've described in our previous books what we call the propaganda two-step, where, Dick Cheney puts out this idea that the smoking gun will be a mushroom cloud in Iraq. Catchy phrase there. Well, you don't get that traction from that, just shouting it from the steps of the White House. No, he slips that to the national security correspondent of the New York Times at that time, Judith Miller. And that morning in the Sunday New York Times, we see the phrase, the smoking gun may be a mushroom cloud. And then Dick Cheney goes on the Sunday shows and says, the smoking gun will be a mushroom cloud, but don't take it from me, take it from the New York Times, and points to the article that morning. Yes, that is that artful two-step. It's in that environment, in this media landscape, that suddenly in 2016, someone who we, in any other time or in any other place, might have been a cartoon character, marches into this world, Donald Trump. And of course, he has a much longer history than 2016. But he understood our media better than our media understood our media. And with his mix of theatrics, misogyny, xenophobia, and lies, he knew something that he could count on. He was irresistible. And in fact, a study was done recently that showed that during the primary campaign, Trump was given an estimated value of $1 billion in free media. Well, we all know what happened to somebody else who was campaigning then, Bernie Sanders. He was lucky to get a second, if anything, on the news, and the Bernie blackout, as it was called. That's what happens when you don't have the power of Donald Trump or the kind of message, hateful messaging that Trump had. So, in journalism, courage is not something that happens in hindsight. Courage is what happens when you speak truth to power, when you are telling inconvenient truths when it matters. And when it matters is the key phrase. It's hard to find anybody who was for launching the Iraq War now, isn't it? Anybody, Republican or Democrat. It was hard to find anybody on the mainstream media who was speaking out against the war back when it happened. And those lies cost lives. There are consequences when our media abdicates its role as challenging those in power. It's not comfortable to challenge these, to tell these truths. And in our new book, we have a section called An Independent Reporter's Rap Sheet. And it's what has happened to Amy over the years when she's been arrested, harassed, detained, beat up, nearly getting killed in Indonesia back in 1991 when she went to cover what became a massacre, witness a massacre in East Timor, her colleague Alan Nairn having his skull fractured by US-made weapons wielded by the Indonesian troops. And later in 2008, there were many other instances, but the short version, arrested, thrown to the ground, and just covering the Republican convention while she was out covering the protests. And then this last year at Standing Rock, and Amy will say more about that, and it is really closing the circle here to be introduced as we were by somebody who is from the Standing Rock Reservation and what it means to have it covered. So Democracy Now! Has been for these 20 years the beating heart of a disparate movement and community that spans the globe. It is the voice, the space that we go to that reassures us that we are not alone and you are not crazy. So here is to... Here's to 20 more years, led by that person who has been holding that microphone high, both capturing the voices, but also shining that light, letting us all know that there is a brighter future ahead and that their voice, they have a seat at the table when they listen to Democracy Now! And my wonderful sister, Amy Goodman.
Well, it is truly wonderful to be here and to be welcomed into this Unitarian Universalist society, this church, that in more ways than one is a sanctuary of dissent. Yesterday, we were in Middlebury and in the evening in Montpelier. And between those two cities, I learned that a man I had come to know and interview at another Unitarian church in Denver in 2015 had just been picked up by ICE. His name is Arturo Hernandez Garcia. And a few years ago in 2015, under the Obama administration, he was concerned that he would be deported. He's married and has 2 children in Denver. He runs a tile business with his brother-in-law. So he took refuge in the Unitarian Church. We went to see him there, to interview him. And it wasn't until he got assurance from the Department of Homeland Security in the form of a letter that said, "You are not a priority for deportation," that he felt in good faith he would leave. He wanted to show other undocumented people in this country that you could feel safe. And he continued to live his life and to work here for 2 more years. Until yesterday, when he was picked up by ICE agents in the morning, when he and his brother-in-law went to pick up the tile for the day that they would be using. His advocates, like the American Friends Service Committee, a woman named Jennifer Piper, who we had on Democracy Now! Today from Denver, called ICE. And they said, "What are you doing?" He has this letter that assures him he is not a priority for deportation. And they said, that was another time. This administration has no priorities. An unusual way to put it. And so people gathered outside the detention center to demand he be released. That hasn't happened at this point. Now, he took refuge for many months in the Unitarian Church in Denver. Just last week, we went back to Denver to the Unitarian Church, where another Mexican immigrant has taken refuge. Her name is Jeanette Vizquera. And she took refuge in February, just after Donald Trump was inaugurated. She was afraid because just a few days before she went into the church, she's a mom of 4, has been in this country for more than 20 years. She saw that Daniel Ramirez in Washington State was picked up. He's a dreamer. He is legally allowed to work and be here. And when she saw that he was picked up, she thought, what hope do we have as people who work so hard, pay taxes, but are undocumented in this country? Her oldest daughter is DACA, and then she feared for her. And then she's got 3 little kids. One of them is Zuri, and she is 6. And she came out when we interviewed her last week to sit on her mom's lap. And Roberto, he's 10. They speak perfect English. And Roberto is just a feather of a kid. And he was holding a lithograph portrait of his mom, Jeanette, that his teacher had made. And now they're making copies of it and they're selling it to support their activist work. She said, make no mistake about it, I'm in this church, but I haven't stopped working from morning till night for other immigrants around the country to make them feel safe. And the poster says, Families United at the bottom. Keep families united. And Roberto was holding this poster as he spoke. He was going out for a Cesar Chavez march that day. His mom can't leave the church. And he had his arm wrapped around her the whole time he spoke to me. And he said, I am my mother's voice. So we played that on Democracy Now! When we came back from Denver. And then we heard the next day. You know that Time magazine puts out its 100 most influential people in the world each year. So they did that last week. Jeanette Vizquera was on the list. So then they had their big gala with all the stars in New York. John Legend was there, among many others. And Jeanette, of course, couldn't go. Because if she steps foot outside that church, she can be arrested by ICE agents. Now, she's gotten a lot of death threats. And I said, so what gives you hope? And she said, I've gotten a lot of death threats, but I've gotten many, many, many more times letters and emails of support from people all over the world. She said, there are many more of them than those that threaten me. And what's so deeply touching is the police chief came to see her because she couldn't go to see him and said, I support you. You tell me if you are threatened in any way. And the mayor as well. And the local congressman as well, Jared Polis. That is the hope. So since she couldn't go out to the New York City gala with all the glitterati, they had a gala for her on Tuesday night at the church. She is one of the most important, 100 most important people in the world, according to Time magazine. So she was protected in that church for the moment, Tuesday night. Wednesday morning is when Arturo was picked up, and you have to wonder if they weren't sending a message. For every person that is picked up, millions are terrorized. It only takes a few people to be arrested for a warning to be sent out to others. And you think about who is being targeted, who is being hunted. Activists. And what can be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? Which is why I'm so honored today that Zuli Palacios and Kike Pacazar are here. Could you both stand up? So Kike and Zuli are activists. They are immigrants' rights activists. They are workers who fight for justice for those who work in the dairy industry. And together with Migrant Justice, and it's great to be here with Will Lombach as well, are pushing to ensure that people who work in the dairy farms of this state are fairly compensated. Now, I think that would be supported by people across the political spectrum, except that just weeks ago, Zuli and Kike were also picked up by ICE agents and held for almost 2 weeks in jail. And I dare say, it was the activism around their cases that ultimately got them released. So I understand Alex has not yet been released. It is so important that people organize. I think in this period, the best of America is being brought out because people are understanding that is all that we have. And we need a media that reflects those on the ground. I am all for reality television, folks, not the kind they bring us, but the kind that reflects the reality of Kike and Zule's life, of Arturo's life, of Jeanette's life, and the people all over this country. That's what we need the media to bring us. We're really honored to be broadcasting from Vermont PBS today and tomorrow. To be able to work with public media in this town, and that they broadcast Democracy Now! Every day. I hope you let them know how much you appreciate it. We certainly do. And of course, WGDR and WDEV. You can ask Vermont Public Radio if they would also run Democracy Now! Because it is a great honor to be able to be a part of an independent media movement that goes to where the silence is. And often it's not that silent. It's just the work and the noise that people are making, the chanting and the sweat and tears of people organizing don't hit the corporate media radar screen, which is why we need independent media. I originally come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded, more than 70 years ago, close to 70 years ago, by a man named Lou Hill, who was a war resister. It came out of the detention camps after World War II and said, there's got to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. The first station, KPFA in Berkeley, 1949, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today. So said George Gerbner, the late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications. Not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today. And so WBAI, my station in New York, went on the air in 1960. WPFW, 1977, and KPFT in Houston, the Petro Metro, in 1970. When that station went on the air, it was a few weeks into their operation. I think they were playing Arlo Guthrie's Alice's Restaurant when it was blown off the air. The Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. And then, when they rebuilt the transmitter, got back on the air a few weeks later, the Klan strapped 15 times the dynamite to the transmitter and blew it up again. Took a few months to get back on their feet. When they did in January of 1971, Arlo Guthrie came back into Houston to finish his song live on the air. And KPFT has been broadcasting ever since. Now, I can't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's Zuli talking about her experience in jail on Democracy Now, or an Iraqi uncle, a Palestinian child, or an Israeli grandmother, or Beverly talking about what's happening at the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation around the Dakota Access Pipeline, you begin to understand where they're coming from. You might not agree with what you hear. I mean, how often do we even agree with our family members? Sorry, Dave. But you come to understand where they're coming from. It makes it much less likely that you'd want to destroy them. It's that understanding that's the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it is wielded as a weapon of war.
which is why we have to take the media back. Now, as President Trump was inaugurated and has gone through his first 100 days, the marker this weekend, and the media talked about the polls indicating he's the least popular president in the history of this country at this point in his presidency, I started to get very nervous. Because when a president is suffering from extremely low poll ratings, he's going to want to distract attention. And he's going to look for an outside enemy, inside and outside, in the case of Donald Trump. Inside, it's immigrants. Inside, it's vilifying what he considers the other, whether it's Mexican immigrants, calling them rapists, or whether it's Muslims. You know Muslim ban 1 and Muslim ban 2. The first Muslim ban that he proposed that would cover refugees from 7 majority Muslim nations was stopped by a so-called judge. That's what the president called the judge who issued a stay on this ban. And then he tried again with his second Muslim ban that would prevent refugees from coming in from 6 majority Muslim nations. I was astounded last week when the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, on a right-wing radio show, talked about the judge who stayed the second ban and asked the question, the Attorney General of the United States asked the question, how is it possible that a man on an island in the Pacific can stop the President of the United States of America? Well, the good news is that I actually think 5th graders would be able to answer that question. Because this country is now engaged in a nationwide civics lesson, learning about the co-equal branches of government, the legislative, the executive, the judiciary, that they are checks and balances on each other. I mean, I think perhaps the only people that were encouraged by that comment was the sovereignty movement in Hawaii, because they were saying, that's right, how is it possible that we are a part of the United States? Maybe this will fuel that movement. But that is what's so important about what's happening today, and the resistance at every level. You know, you had the day after the inauguration. Well, you have the inauguration day. And President Trump had like 180,000 people at his inauguration. It's a very respectable number. It is not such a big deal, something to be proud of, except that when the photos showed that President Obama's was much larger than President Trump's from 9 years before, maybe to the tune of 90% larger, right? He had something like 1.8 million people at his first inauguration. Donald Trump, 180,000. It was just a fact, but still it was a big crowd for Trump. He lost it, Trump. And he, instead of trying to figure out how to become more popular, to be supported by many more, just said it simply wasn't true despite the pictures. It's the Trump administration's alternative facts, a term they have coined, which I'm sure will enter the lexicon and better equal the word lies, because that's what we're talking about. And what's amazing and encouraging is that the corporate media, which doesn't always stand up, has stood up together and actually called out those in power who are not telling the truth. This is a very important time for the media. When the media sounds like Democracy Now! And talks about the importance of being independent, that's really important. I mean, David and I, our first book was The Exception to the Rulers. That's what all the media should be. That's our job. Our second book was called Static. And the reason we called it that is even in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we get is static, that veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. And so, the only problem with the hoopla that was made about the difference between the sizes of Trump and Obama's inauguration crowd is that it somewhat obscured what happened the next day, not 9 years before, when hundreds of thousands of people, over 500,000 people, mainly women, came out in Washington, D.C. to voice their resistance. And not only in Washington, but all over the country. Washington's crowd was not as large as Los Angeles, 750,000 people. And then you've got scale, right? What happened here in Vermont with the interstate closed, in Montpelier with 20,000 people coming out. And in Park City, Utah, 10,000 people in this tiny city. These were protests that were larger than any these cities have seen. Women voicing their alarm, talking about reproductive rights. And the response of President Trump was 2 days later on his first full day in office. And in a sense for him, maybe it was poetic justice, issued a global gag order, right? Very interesting. That would stop the funding for international organizations that were involved not only in providing abortion. So it was very interesting to hear Jean talk about Planned Parenthood being founded in the basement of this church. Not only in providing abortion, but it would stop money going to international aid organizations that even talked about abortion as an option. And that was just the beginning. And then you had the protests around the Muslim bans. Thousands of people heading to the airports, whether it was JFK or Los Angeles Airport or Dulles. I mean, a judge and a senator were manhandled by security at Dulles Airport, come to express their alarm at what was happening. And the lawyer from the ACLU who argued the case against the ban in Brooklyn, he goes into the Brooklyn court, disheveled. It's like 24 hours after the ban has been issued. He comes out, and there are 1,000 people showing solidarity outside the Brooklyn courthouse. President Trump asks, who's paying for this? I mean, he has reason to wonder because it is how he thinks. When he announced his candidacy for president of the United States, he paid actors to be there at Trump Tower to applaud for him. And so that is how he thinks. It's a kind of projection. Like, why would people just go out if they weren't being paid? And then you had tax day. This morning I interviewed your former governor, Madeleine Kunin, on Democracy Now! She was out on tax day demanding the president release his taxes, as all presidents, Republican and Democrat, have done for decades. You know, interestingly, Jeanette Vizquera, the Mexican immigrant in the Unitarian Church in Denver, the day she was named one of the most important people in the world, she held her tax returns, right? And she said, I'll show you mine, now let him show you his. And he asked, who is paying these people? That's what he tweeted out. That was his question. And now you have what's happened in this past week. We went down to Washington for the March for Science, and we broadcast from 10 to 3 at democracynow.org, and we're going to do the same on Saturday. We're headed down tomorrow. We'll be there for the People's Climate March, so do tune in, democracynow.org. But the March for Science was amazing. Thousands of people in Washington and all over the country, and on every continent in the world. Especially exhilarating were the young girls who came out, the aspiring scientists, who said facts matter. I was looking at all the signs people were holding. You had one woman holding a sign that said, "I'm with her," and there was an arrow to Mother Earth. You have another sign, "Ice has no agenda, it just melts." And there is no planet B. And then you had the little buttons that everyone was wearing that said science, not silence. There was the little girl, Hazel, 12 years old, who was suing President Trump. Oh, she had sued President Obama before. She was part of a group of kids. And the judge has let this case go forward, who are suing the administrations of the United States for endangering their future, for this reliance on a fossil fuel economy. And then we interviewed one of the people who spoke on the main stage, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. She's an amazing pediatrician from Flint, Michigan. Associate professor at Michigan State, runs the Hurley's Children's Hospital there. She's the woman who blew open the story about the lead poisoning of the children of Flint. I mean, Democracy Now! Did a documentary on this called The Poisoning of American City. And the story of Flint is a lesson to us all. The governor appointed unelected managers. At one point in the last few years, more than half of the African American cities in Michigan were being run by appointed unelected city managers. So you can, elect your little city councils and your mayors, but they become the employees and must answer to an unelected city manager. And this was happening all over Michigan. And the city manager in Flint decided that he would take Flint off its safe water supply that they had used for 80 years, the Detroit water system, and instead hook up the city to the polluted, corrosive Flint River, to the shock of the entire city. He thought they could save a few $1 million that way. He should have been concerned about saving lives. And so the people started to get sick. Their water started to stink and to turn color. I interviewed a union worker at the local GM plant. It's the engine plant. They make engine heads. Very early on, after they changed the water supply, GM noticed that, and the workers noticed that, the engines were corroding as soon as they were being made. So they applied to the unelected city manager for a waiver to go back to the Detroit water supply because they couldn't sell their engines. And they got that waiver. So the city and the state knew that this water, if it was corroding engines, imagine what it was doing to the human body, and think what the workers were thinking. Here they were making these engines. They understood they'd switch the water supply back, but what about them? These workers whose families, who they themselves live in Flint, Michigan. And then Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha started to crunch the numbers. She said, what's happening to our kids? And she was able to prove that thousands of children were being contaminated by lead from the Flint River. She held a news conference. She didn't wait for it to be published in a peer-reviewed publication because she wasn't there for awards. She was there to save the children. Oh, the state went after her, tried to tear her apart, her findings apart, somehow discredit her any way they could. But the science held up, and they were forced to admit that Dr. Mona was right. She blew the lid on this entire scandal. So Dr. Mona Atisha was there as a role model talking about this, saying it's science that is so important that we cannot ignore. And she just wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times that said, the next doctor, what happens if we lose the next doctor to expose the next Flint? Because you see, Dr. Mona is an Iraqi American. Her family came to this country as refugees in the 1990s. And she said, with this Muslim ban, the first one that was proposed, she never would have been able to come into this country. And this brings me back to President Trump targeting external enemies to take our attention away. As he responded to the terrible gas attack in Syria by slamming an air base with 59 Raytheon Tomahawk cruise missiles that he personally profits from, we believe, with the last indications we have of his investments in Raytheon. And of course, the airstrip able to be used the next day. That by bombing Syria, that was the first attack on the Syrian government, but they continued after that and well before that to bomb Syrian cities and kill untold numbers of Syrians. You understand when he says, what can we do? We must help the people of Syria, which we must help. We must help the people of Syria. Still, they will not allow in one Syrian refugee into this country if he has his way. He wants to increase the Pentagon budget by $54 billion and slash the State Department by a third, with the full assent of the new head, the new Secretary of State, the former CEO of the largest private oil corporation in the world, ExxonMobil, Rex Tillerson. So you slash the State Department, you slash aid to international aid organizations, and you vastly increase the budget of the Pentagon. When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. How do you solve conflict when you only have one tool in your toolkit? And so there's the attack in Syria. There's in his first days as president, this botched raid in Yemen that killed a Navy SEAL. And we don't exactly know how many children and women and male civilians in Yemen. And then the dropping of the Moab in Afghanistan. The nickname for it is the mother of all bombs, so named by the Pentagon. Massive ordnance air blast. Its radius of blast is a mile. It is the largest non-nuclear bomb that has been dropped in the world. It was developed under the Bush administration. He didn't dare use it. Obama didn't dare use it. Just give Trump a few weeks and he drops the biggest non-nuclear bomb ever dropped in the world. And how does the media respond? The media has been critical. The media has been calling him out. The media has been talking about alternative facts and lies, as they should. But when he does this, and we've seen it so many times before, the media circles wagons around the White House in a time of war. And they say, he's become presidential. For some reason, it's there that they stop asking questions. I mean, go back to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. It was no different. You know, more than half the population, I think, was evenly divided for the war, against the war, in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. FAIR did a study, the four major nightly newscasts, NBC, CBS, ABC, and the PBS NewsHour, in 2 weeks around Colin Powell giving his push for war at the UN, February 5th, 2003. There were 393 interviews done around war. How many with anti-war leaders? at a time when the population was evenly divided, 393 interviews, only 3. 3 of almost 400. It's not a mainstream media. It's an extreme media beating the drums for war. When we cover war, we need a media that's not brought to us by the weapons manufacturers. When we cover climate change, we need a media not brought to us by the oil, the gas, the coal companies, and the nuclear companies. When we cover healthcare, we need a media that's not brought to us by the insurance industry and big pharma. We need a media that is brought to us by listeners, viewers, readers, people committed to hearing the authentic voices of people on the ground who are experts in their own lives and not what we get on the networks. The small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. So I can't talk about Democracy Now! Without talking about Juan Gonzalez, who's been part of Democracy Now! For its entire 21 years. Juan last year was the first Latino journalist to win to be inducted into the Journalism Hall of Fame in New York, and we all went to the celebration. You know, he was inducted with Charlie Rose and Leslie Stahl and Max Frankel of the New York Times and other journalists. And when he got up, he put the others to shame with his speech. Now, he had worked at the New York Daily News for 29 years. He just retired from the Daily News. But he's staying with his other DN, Democracy Now! And he's going on to be a professor at Rutgers University. Those students are very lucky. When Juan retired last year, we were on the speaking tour again when the hardcover of the book came out. And so I was speaking, I was getting all these text pictures of Juan's parties. I mean, it was one retirement party after another. I mean, it was crazy. One of them was at the Francis Tavern in Lower Manhattan. And I mean, every leading politician was there. Governor Cuomo was there, and then when he left, Mayor de Blasio came. They can't be in the same room because they hate each other. And you know, Senator Schumer. And as I'm going through these cities, I'm saying, Juan, this is not a good sign. We are the fourth estate. We're not for the state. We're supposed to cover power, not cover for power. How is it all these politicians are hailing you? But I decided that the reason they actually showed up at these retirement parties, they wanted to make sure with their own eyes that this guy was leaving and would stop dogging him. So Juan got up and gave a speech when he was inducted into the Journalism Hall of Fame. And a part of what he said was, I figured my modest contribution would be not writing about outcast neighborhoods, but from them. Not simply to entertain, but to change. Not after the fact, but before it, when coverage could still make a difference. He said, I've tried to use as many of my columns as possible to probe the injustices visited upon the powerless. Yes, the rich and famous are also victims on occasion, but they have so many politicians, lobbyists, lawyers, gossip columnists, and even editorial writers ready to jump to their defense that they'll always do fine without my help. I prefer the desperate unknown reader who comes to me because he or she has gone everywhere else and no one will listen. More often than not, I come across unexpected gems, human beings whose tragedies illuminate the landscape and whose courage hopefully inspires the reader to believe that there is indeed some greater good served by a free press than just chronicling or influencing the ouster of one group of politicians by another. The great words of Juan Gonzalez, and certainly expressing the mission of Democracy Now! So as we travel in this many-city tour that we have Denis Moynihan to blame for, this master tour guide who drives us to zigzag across the country, to reach out to communities everywhere, to get word out about independent media, we have to cover what's happening every day. And what has happened in the last few weeks has truly been astounding at so many different levels. Many of you may have heard about what's taking place in Arkansas. Arkansas announcing just a few weeks ago that they would kill 8 men in 11 days. 8 condemned prisoners on death row in 11 days. And it would all happen by the end of April. Why? Because that was the date, the end of April, that their execution drug, midazolam, would expire. The execution drug, midazolam, would expire, so they had to use it before it went bad. When I first heard this story, I said, well, wait a second, what does it mean when a drug goes bad? It can kill you? Or it doesn't work anymore? And why can't they get more? And why would they use this as a reason? I mean, it's not a reason of justice, the legal system. It's because a drug is going to expire. And so they announced they would have 3 double headers. Now, I am the aunt of one Jasper Goodman, who is a junior in high school in Waterbury. And I know what a double header means because he is a great broadcast journalist who covers the Red Sox. Except that's not what a double header means in this case. It means they would kill 2 men on successive nights, each night a double header. This is America. Very few people realize in the world how alone we are in the industrialized world when it comes to imposing the death penalty. So we spoke on Democracy Now! To the Guardian's chief reporter, Ed Pilkington, about this shocking double execution Arkansas carried out just last Monday night. The first 2 in a night, their executions were stayed. And then Leland Lee, which the ACLU said might have a very good case for innocence, was executed. So why is it that he didn't get access to justice? You know what happens with the death penalty. I mean, in murder cases in this country, far less than 1% of cases actually get the death penalty imposed. So what determines whether you'll get the death penalty? Race and your economic status and your access to adequate representation, not drunken lawyers like Leland Lee got. I mean, the scene of the murder, gruesome at the time, covered in blood. He did not have a speck of blood on him. And so the ACLU was desperately at the last minute trying to challenge this case, but they did not succeed. In his case, it went to the Supreme Court. It was just last week. And the newest Supreme Court justice made the difference. Yes, that was Neil Gorsuch in a 5-4 decision. Leland Lee was put to death. And then Monday night, the first of the double headers. Oh, I should say one other thing about these drug companies. Europe was the first to stop European drug companies from selling death drugs to the United States. European Union forbid it, and European drug companies said no. I mean, they understand they have a history going back to World War II and the Nazis. Yes, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer. Adolf Hitler did use chemical warfare against his own people, though he denied this in the White House press briefing to the shock of so many. You remember what he said? Adolf Hitler, however despicable he was, at least did not use gas on his own people. And then he went on as he tried to recover. As journalists said, do you really want to say this? He referred to concentration camps as Holocaust centers. So European drug companies have already said no. And then there's American companies. And one of those companies, McKesson, sued Arkansas, saying that Arkansas, the state, had misrepresented what they were going to use midazolam for, vercuronium bromide for, another of the chemicals in the death penalty cocktail, that they didn't tell them it was going to be used to put men to death. And so they sued the state, and a judge ruled in their favor. Judge Wendell Griffin. And after he did this, he walked outside. It was Good Friday, Little Rock, Arkansas. And this African-American judge walked over to the governor's mansion and laid down on a cot to protest the death penalty. These are the heroes of this country, unsung, rarely mentioned by the corporate media, who put their bodies on the line. Immediately, he had all capital cases taken from him. You may have heard the same happen to the young African-American woman state's attorney in Florida, who said, oh, she will definitely enforce justice and be very severe about it. But she simply did not agree with the death penalty. And so the governor of Florida, Rick Scott, pulled all capital cases from her, and she sued him. That's where that stands right now. So back to this doubleheader last Monday night. Let me describe how it played out. It was the first time in 17 years that any state has killed two people on the same day. At 7:20 p.m. Arkansas time, 52-year-old Jack Harold Jones was pronounced dead in the death chamber at the Cummins Unit State Prison. Infirmary workers had spent more than 45 minutes unsuccessfully trying to put a central line into his neck. According to a court filing during Jones' execution, he was moving his lips and gulping for air, which suggests he continued to be conscious during the lethal injection. Lawyers for the second man, Marcel Williams, filed a last-minute appeal for a stay of execution following Jones' killing, arguing Williams could also experience a botched, painful death. A district court judge initially granted a temporary stay of Williams' execution, but then allowed it to go forward. Williams was pronounced dead at 10:33 p.m. The executions came after legal challenges reached the U.S. Supreme Court, which rejected a stay for Williams. The only justice to dissent in this ruling was Justice Sonia Sotomayor. The last double execution carried out in the United States was carried out in Texas in the year 2000. And that made me think about what's happened in this country over the years and the resistance to the death penalty. And I want to go back for a minute to the year 2011, the year that rocked the world. You remember the beginning, actually December 2010, Tunisia. A young man named Mohamed Bouazizi comes out of the university, has no opportunity in Tunisia with its corrupt dictatorship, and he ends up selling fruit and vegetables in the marketplace. The authorities steal his scale, he can't take it anymore, and he sets himself on fire. And that's the spark for the Tunisian revolution that overthrew the dictator. And that sparked the Egyptian revolution, which was astounding at the time. 1 million people in Tahrir, and you heard it play out on Democracy Now! With the amazing reporter, Sharif Abdel-Quddus, reporting from Tahrir, our Egyptian-American senior producer who went back home to cover events then and right through to today. And our remarkable videographer, Hani Massoud, also an Egyptian-American who was at his side filming as he interviewed people who were simply neighbors, who actually came out and gathered, like Adaf Suef, the great Egyptian writer who wrote Map of Love, sending us to two very pregnant women who said they wouldn't give birth until Mubarak fell, or Nawal Saadawi, the 79-year-old physician and writer who had been, imprisoned and exiled by Nasser and Mubarak, and was telling young people, even before the uprising, we will win, we will win. And the young high school student who stood in front of the state media building that had spewed lies for so many decades, putting out the broadsheet, Voices of Tahrir. These are the people of a community, of a country, who just banded together and said, we will forge ahead to make a more democratic future. Where Egypt is today is a whole other story that we continue to cover. But then you move to the Wisconsin uprising just a month later, which many say was partly inspired by the Arab Spring. 150,000 Wisconsinites marching in the freezing cold, taking on the governor who threatened to bust the public unions. That's right, Governor Scott Walker, who would later run for president, said he was going to bust the teacher and nurses unions. But he assured the police and the firefighters he wasn't going to touch them. His problem was that the police and the firefighters were married to the teachers and nurses. And so everyone occupied the state capitol, and they slept there and they lived there, thousands of people. I never saw anything like it. I mean, in front of the governor's office, you had young people with dreads who were drumming on anything they could find, and the police were rocking out next to them. That's a little different from my city, New York. I saw the biggest guys I had ever seen in the state capitol, the Oshkosh prison guards. And I said to them, "Who did you vote for?" And they said, "Governor Walker." And I said, "So what are you doing here?" And they said, "Protesting Governor Walker." He said he didn't tell us he was going to do this. And I saw this older gentleman in the cold and the snow marching outside with a sign that said, "IRS auditors against Walker." I said, "Are you a Democrat or a Republican?" He said, "I'm a Republican." And everyone banded together. And then you move forward to the summer of 2011, 1,200 people make a ring around the White House, or actually thousands, and 1,200 get arrested. Among them, your very own Bill McKibben of Middlebury College and 350.org, who will be on Democracy Now! Tomorrow from Washington, where he is organizing the People's Climate March the next day. Naomi Klein, who will also be there in Washington. You'll hear them all on Democracy Now! On Saturday, 10 to 3. Make sure you check it out. By the way, if you want to sign up for our Daily Digest to get our news headlines every day and our news alerts, we've been passing around sign-up sheets. But you can also just sign up on your phone by texting the word Democracy Now!, one word, no space, to the number 66866. 66866, and you can get our headlines and news alerts. And also, if you put out anything tonight or any pictures or quote anything, use the hashtag covering the movements as we keep track as we go across the country. So that's all that was happening in 2011. Bill, Naomi, and so many others were protesting the Keystone XL pipeline. It's not that President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton wanted to kill the pipeline, but the enormous resistance to it that was sustained over years forced them to do it. And then you move to September 17, 2011, when thousands streamed into Zuccotti Park. It was Occupy Wall Street. And that started a movement like we have never seen, not only in New York, but all over the country, these encampments. And yes, ultimately the police went after the encampments and struck them down. And you might say, well, you know, that was a movement that fizzled out. What did that come to? Well, you would be terribly wrong to say that. Because occupy the language. You say the word 1% and 99% right now, and people know you're not talking about milk. People know exactly what you are talking about. When you change the language, you change the world. Now, the media mocked Occupy at first. Well, first they didn't cover it at all. And then when they did, Erin Burnett, you know, on CNN started out front. She started it right around then. And I remember she talked about how she was going to start the show that would go to the people. And one of her first, if not her first, segment on her first show of Out Front, she went to Occupy. And like so much of the corporate media, it was the mocking. The name of that segment was Seriously? And you know how they went after the activists. They would say, I mean, what do these people stand for? You've got people against the death penalty, against war, against inequality, against climate change. They can't make up their minds. And all I could think is, oh my God, the media is listening. Yes, that is what these people stand for. And they would say, why don't you have just a leader who will speak? Well, it wasn't a leaderless movement. It was a leaderful movement. And that was its power. And among the signs that were being carried to Occupy Wall Street was I am Troy Davis, and too much doubt. Troy Anthony Davis was slated to die 4 days later in Georgia, September 21st, 2011. So we flew from New York to Georgia to cover the execution. If we could broadcast an execution, we would. I know that sounds gruesome and horrific, and it certainly would be. But if people could see the images, If people could understand what is done in our name. Now, we couldn't go inside the execution chamber, but we could broadcast from outside, and we went on the prison grounds of Jackson, Georgia that day. We didn't know what would happen. Troy Davis had already had 3 death warrants against him. This was the 4th. The 3 had been vacated. On September 21st, 2011, Troy Anthony Davis was scheduled to die. We were reporting live from the grounds outside Georgia's death row in the town of Jackson, awaiting news about whether the U.S. Supreme Court would spare his life. I Am Troy Davis had become the rallying cry of a growing international movement to stop his execution. The effort had grown and now included prosecutors, prison wardens, exonerated death row prisoners, a former U.S. president, and the Pope. This is the story of a struggle against death that refuses to die. Troy Davis grew up in Savannah with his sisters, his mother and father. His father, a Korean War vet. His mother was a nurse in a local hospital. She worked at the local hospital. On the night of August 18, 1989, Troy, who was 18 years old, an African-American teenager, went to Charlie Brown's pool hall with a friend. In the parking lot outside, Sylvester Red Coles, a neighborhood tough, was arguing loudly with a homeless man named Larry Young. Several witnesses testified later Coles pistol-whipped Young. Pool hall patrons came outside to see what was going on. Troy tried to intervene in the fight, but fled when Coles threatened him with a gun. At 1:15 in the morning, Mark McPhail, a white off-duty Savannah police officer who was working as a security guard at a Greyhound bus station next door, came outside to break up the fight. Gunshots pierced the summer night. Moments later, McPhail lay dying with a bullet wound to the head and another to his heart. He never drew his gun. He was a hero cop. He'd gone to try to help a homeless man who was being pistol whipped. So the question was, who murdered Mark McPhail? Well, it was Red Coles who, together with his lawyer, raced to the police station and identified Troy Davis as the shooter. But the day after the shooting, Troy and his cousin went to Atlanta 4 hours away to look for a job. They didn't know that the police had launched a high-profile manhunt and splashed his picture across newspapers and TV. Davis's panicked family alerted Troy that authorities were looking for him. His sister Martina said, "I'm going to come and get you. We'll go to the police." Martina is a heroine. She was a Persian Gulf War nurse. She was battling breast cancer herself. She was honored along with Nancy Pelosi as a leading light in Washington. Her face adorned the mammogram vans of Savannah to get especially poorer African-American women to get mammograms, and now she was fighting for her brother's life. I mean, she didn't know what was going on. She got her brother. Troy was 18. They immediately went to the police station. They said this is a case of mistaken identity. Davis was immediately arrested. He was held for 2 years, and then he was tried and he was convicted. He would serve the next 20 years on death row, half of his life. 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses would later recant or change their testimony, many of them saying the police had intimidated them and forced them to say what they said. And this is why there were 3 death warrants that were vacated for Troy Davis. Among those who were speaking on Davis's behalf were former President and Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles, in granting Davis a stay back in 2007, wrote, "It will not allow an execution to proceed in this state unless there's no doubt as to the guilt of the accused." But it was that doubt that galvanized so many people around the world. That day that we went down to Jackson, there were protests in Germany, Iceland, Greece, France, in so many different places. The chorus for clemency grew. Dr. Alan Alt, who was the prison warden at that prison years before, got together with 5 other previous wardens or directors of state prisons and wrote to the governor of Georgia, Nathan Deal, pleading for him not to kill Troy Davis. Dr. Alan Alt said, while most of the prisoners whose executions we participated in accepted responsibility for the crimes for which they were punished, some of us have also executed prisoners who maintained their innocence until the end. It's those cases that are most haunting to an executioner, they wrote. So we got the press packet from the Department of Corrections about what would happen that day. They said that he could see his family until 3 o'clock, then he would have to clear out for a routine physical. A routine physical? And that's what the human rights leaders pondered in a church down the road. As Ed DuBose, the head of the Georgia chapter of the NAACP, would say, so they could make sure he's physically fit, so they can strap him down, so they can put the murder juice in his arm. Make no mistake, they call it an execution, we call it murder. See, not long before that, a Texas man on death row had attempted suicide. They raced him to the hospital, got him better, and then they executed him. So we also saw in that press packet a description of what Troy Davis would be offered for dinner. He had turned down the special meal that condemned prisoners get, and so they said this would be the standard fare. Quote, grilled cheeseburgers, oven brown potatoes, baked beans, coleslaw, cookies, and a grape beverage. And then the next page listed the lethal cocktail that would follow. It was on a white page, just 4 lines, sort of like you get in an eye doctor's office when you're testing, the eye chart. Our dad was an ophthalmologist, so I was very used to this. Except this one said pentobarbital, pancuronium bromide, potassium chloride, and Ativan, in parentheses, a sedative. The pentobarbital anesthetizes, the pancuronium bromide paralyzes, and the potassium chloride stops the heart. Davis refused the Last Supper and the sedative. By 7 p.m., the U.S. Supreme Court was reportedly reviewing Davis's plea for a stay. The case was referred to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who hails from Pinpoint, Georgia, a community founded by freed slaves that's near Savannah, where Davis had lived. Now, let me just describe how the media works. We went to the prison, and we went on the property. There were satellite trucks, broadcast trucks, at the edge of the property, and we had also rented a satellite truck with the videographers from Atlanta. When you're going to cover something like this, you want to do it like the big boys do it. And so our truck was bigger than all of the others. The only problem was it was late, and the prison guards warned us that when this satellite truck came, it would have to go to the perimeter where the other satellite trucks were. But, we were going to do a broadcast for hours. I wasn't just going to talk hour after hour. I wanted to talk to people who had come to be on the grounds to find out why. The guards had erected a pen for the protesters. About 150 would be allowed on the property, and that would be the human rights leaders, the head of Amnesty, NAACP, the family, like Martina, who is now in a wheelchair, who would die weeks later. And then 1,000 people were outside the prison grounds, like the students from Spelman and Morehouse in Atlanta, the traditionally historic black colleges carrying candles, and people from all over the world. So finally, the satellite truck came. And it came up onto the property. They rolled down the window. They said, Miss Goodman, where do you want the van? And I said, well, the guards are saying you have to put it over with the other satellite. Where do you want it? I said, my annoyance is dissolving now. And I said, well, I was hoping just by that protest pen. And they barrel the satellite truck over to the protest pen. And the guards are coming over to tell the truck to move. And these guys got out. They were bigger than the Oshkosh prison guards. And they were definitely bigger than these Georgia guards. And they brought out their big cameras, and the guards backed off. And then they formed a kind of semicircle around me like a shield, and they handed me the microphone. And they said, where do you want to stand? I said, well, I guess right up against this rope so I can interview people. They said, begin broadcasting. And so we did. We started at 6. We didn't know what would happen. At 7 o'clock, again, Clarence Thomas got the case. Needless to say, a few hours later, the Supreme Court denied the plea. Davis's execution began at 10:53 p.m. A prison spokesperson delivered the news to the reporters outside, time of death 11:08 p.m. The eyewitnesses to the execution stepped out. According to an Associated Press reporter who was there, these were Troy Davis's last words. You know, he's strapped to a gurney in the execution chamber, a gurney like a cross, his arms out, his legs strapped down, the injection put in his arm. And it's at that point that they pull back the curtains on the window and the audience watches the state kill this man to teach the world that you should not kill. Troy Davis's last words, as reported by the Associated Press: "I'd like to address the McPhail family. Let you know I'm not the one who killed your son, your father, your brother. I am innocent. I did not have a gun. All I can ask is that you look deeper into this case so that you really can finally see the truth. I ask my family and friends to continue to fight the fight." And then he looked at his executioners and said, "For those about to take my life, God have mercy on your souls, and may God bless your souls." The state of Georgia took Davis's body to Atlanta for an autopsy, charging his family for the transportation. On Troy Davis's death certificate, the cause of death is listed simply as homicide. As we stood on the grounds of the prison just after Troy Davis was executed, the Georgia Department of Corrections threatened to pull the plug on our broadcast. The show was over. And I was reminded of what Mahatma Gandhi reportedly answered when asked what he thought of Western civilization. He said, "I think it would be a good idea." Now, the end of December of 2011 was the month of the UN Climate Summit. That year it was in Durban, South Africa. And we go to all the climate summits, and you might say, why waste the fuel? We went to Copenhagen, Durban, Doha, Peru, Poland, Paris. We're going to Bonn next year. But what happens in these climate summits? We don't go for the people inside. We go for the thousands who come from the most hard-hit countries on earth, who are desperate to have someone help them with the effects of climate change. In Copenhagen, I think of the 15-year-old boy who looked directly into our camera and said, "You are drowning our country." I think of the people of sub-Saharan Africa who said, "You are cooking our continent." You know, the US is the historically greatest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. We have a responsibility not only to deal with the disparate climate conditions in this country, but to help people all over that support or are feeling the effects of our lifestyle. And I think of what happened at the end of this Durban summit in South Africa. There was a breach. Young people who were outside were invited in to address the summit. And the youth chose as their spokesperson a woman who went to College of the Atlantic in Maine named Anjali Appadurai. And she stood up before the world body. And this is a part of what she said. She said, "I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in the hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money? You've been negotiating all of my life. You've failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, you've broken promises, but you've heard this all before. We're in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. Where is the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion. There is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top. 2011 was the year when the radical became reality. And then she ended by quoting Nelson Mandela, who said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." And she looked out on the crowd, on the assembled gathering, and said, "So distinguished delegates and governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now, get it done. And there was actually applause throughout the room of world leaders and scientists and bureaucrats. And the president of the Conference of Parties, the COP, said, on a purely personal note, I wonder why we let not speak half the world's population first in this conference, but only last. And the next year, we saw Anjali in Doha. And she was outside, and I said, will you be coming inside the conference? And she said, no, I've been banned. And I want to end by talking about how honored today, how honored I am to be here, here in Burlington, and to be introduced by Beverly Little Thunder. I want to end on this massive issue of climate change and the fate of the planet, and how honored I am to be in the presence of a Native American who was in North Dakota, and to talk about what the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, the people of Standing Rock, have done for this country and the world. Last April 1st, LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux, stood up and said she would open her property along the Cannonball River to those who would come to fight the Dakota Access Pipeline, that $3.8 billion pipeline that would snake its way from North Dakota, take the fracked oil from the Bakken oil fields, from North Dakota to South Dakota, through Iowa, Illinois, and then meet up with a pipeline down to the Gulf of Mexico. They call it the Black Snake. And they said that if this pipeline made its way under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America, that it threatened the population of 17 million people downstream, threatened the water supply. They didn't call themselves protesters, they called themselves water protectors. And the resistance grew. One resistance camp, then two, then three. There was the Red Warrior camp and others. First scores, then hundreds, then thousands of people came. It was the largest unification of Native American tribes in decades, from Latin America, from the United States, and from Canada, the First Nations, and their non-Native allies. And we've never seen anything like this. And they gathered in North Dakota. Now, we were covering this. We were late to the game. I mean, covered it from afar. And then in September of 2016, and this is the midst of the election year, we went to North Dakota, and it was Labor Day weekend, and the Native Americans on that weekend did not expect the bulldozers to be moving forward. It was a holiday weekend. We were recording the ceremonies, and then a group of Native Americans went up on property that they had designated as their tribal burial ground. A judge was going to hear the case the next week and asked the tribe to give him a map that showed where their sacred ground was. And so they complied, and they did. The judge would then give that map to Energy Transfer Partners, which owns the Dakota Access Pipeline. And what the Native Americans believe is that they took that map, and when the Native Americans came to plant their flags on this property, they saw the bulldozers operating at full tilt. They believed that, they had been miles away, that they leapfrogged over where they were and used this map that they had drawn to destroy the sacred burial ground, so that when the judge was going to make his decision the next week, the facts on the ground would change. They would have destroyed this property. It would be a moot point. And they were horrified. And so they came up on the property, and it was first led by women, some of them holding the hands of their children. And they demanded the bulldozer stop. It was frightening, the bravery of standing in front of a bulldozer. It may not sound like this, but at the time, when I saw these bulldozers excavating, I could only think back to March 16, 2003, 3 days before the invasion of Iraq, in a different place in Gaza, Rafah. A young college student named Rachel Corey came from Evergreen College in Washington. And she had gone to show solidarity with the Palestinian people. She befriended this pharmacist family. His home was about to be bulldozed by a Caterpillar bulldozer made in the US, run by the Israeli military. And she and some other ISM activists, International Solidarity Movement activists, had donned these orange vests, like construction workers wear, so that they could be seen fully, and stood in front of the bulldozers that would destroy this pharmacist's home. And she was just enveloped in the moving earth and crushed to death. That's what I thought about when I saw the people coming up on the bulldozers, terrified that they would be hurt. But they didn't stop and actually pushed the bulldozers back. It was amazing to see these bulldozers pulling back, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, going backwards down the road as the women, children, and men move forward. And then the Dakota Access Pipeline security guards unleashed dogs on the water protectors. And the dogs were biting the horses and the people. We were filming a dog with its nose and mouth dripping with blood, with Native American blood. The Native Americans stopped the excavation at that moment. They were injured, they were hurt by the pepper spray and the dogs. We posted that video online that night. And within 48 hours, there were 14 million views on Facebook alone. Now, this was an election year. In the media, during the general election season, none of those journalists, I call them news personalities, asked one of the presidential candidates about the issue of climate change that the Native Americans had been dealing with now for months, and of course beyond that. Not one of them had asked about this issue that determines the fate of the planet. The media will say, well, people aren't interested. Really? So explain the 14 million views then. And it just got larger and larger. We flew back to New York, and the judge was going to rule on Friday. It didn't look good for the tribe. So on Thursday night, the governor, Dalrymple at the time, called out the National Guard. And then quietly the authorities issued an arrest warrant for me, but I didn't know that at the time. And Friday, the judge did rule against the tribe. The Justice Department prevailed over the Standing Rock Sioux. That week, Obama was in Laos, his first visit to Laos. And his final act was to have a democracy forum for young people around Asia. And they came from different countries. And the last person to ask him a question was a young woman from Malaysia. And she raised her hand and said, President Obama, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline? No American journalist had asked President Obama publicly about DAPL. And it took this young woman who came in to learn about democracy from the President of the United States to ask the question. He held forth eloquently on the history of oppression of Native peoples in the United States. And then he actually responded to her. He said, on that question of the DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, I'd have to get back to you on that. I have to talk to my team. And word has it he came back to, that week, he came back to Washington. And he may have seen the video of the dogs. On the day that this happened, on Saturday of Labor Day, we interviewed Winona Laduke, another Native American activist from the White Rose, from the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. And she said, Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama 1965. She said, we are through. We are through. And those images of the dogs from the civil rights movement. I'm sure they were not lost on President Obama. The judge ruled against the tribe. His own Justice Department prevailed against the Standing Rock Sioux. They were probably about to pop their champagne corks on that Friday afternoon when 15 minutes later, an unprecedented 3-agency letter was issued from the Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Interior, and the Justice Department. I guess other lawyers or higher ups. This was coordinated from the White House saying, we're going to stop. We have to evaluate. What was the Native input on this? Was there an environmental impact statement? Yes, President Obama was now paying attention because of the resistance and the sacrifice of so many people and hundreds who had been arrested, mainly Native American. And I went that Friday to Canada. I wasn't fleeing. I was invited to the Toronto International Film Festival because they were premiering a film called All Governments Lie about the great muckraking journalist I.F. Stone. And they were talking about independent media organizations that were doing journalistic work today, like, Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone, Democracy Now!, me and Nermeen Sheikh went up. And we spoke after the premiere, and I thought I could talk about the Dakota Access Pipeline. People in Canada care about First Nations. Next day, invited to the University of Toronto to speak. We're in the middle of a talk. It was a gathering like this. And in the middle of my talk, I got a text that said, "You're under arrest." And I was very confused. I didn't understand where it come from. It actually said something like, "There's an arrest warrant out for you." And I didn't know the number. I thought this is a total scam. There's nothing to be worried about. But then I noticed it was a North Dakota number. And oh my goodness, what could this mean? And it turned out it was from a North Dakota lawyer. And I thought, well, I have a little problem because when there's an arrest warrant, you don't necessarily get picked up right away. But if you have to deal with police or FBI or border guards, that's when you could be picked up if they see that there is something in the system. And I had to go back over the border into the United States. So I said, could someone call a cab? I need to go to the airport. I wasn't going to say what happened because I needed to get back into the US before this got into the system, if I was lucky. And I did manage to, and I came back to New York. And I didn't take the arrest warrant personally. I think this was a warning to journalists all over the country: do not come to North Dakota, which is exactly why we need to be there, to shine a spotlight. So I was particularly concerned about young independent journalists, that they would be afraid to go, thinking they couldn't afford to deal with being arrested and everything like that. They just wanted to cover the struggle, and a message had to be sent back. So a few weeks later, we flew back to North Dakota, the whole team. And as we landed in Bismarck, we thought we would call their bluff. The prosecutors announced they would drop the charges, which was a good thing, but then announced they would up the charges against me. They would charge me with riot. I could land in jail for a year. This was Friday afternoon. And they said I would be arraigned on the following Monday. So that was the whole weekend to cover what was happening among the Standing Rock Sioux. I mean, hundreds of people have been arrested at this point. And on Monday morning, we broadcast from in front of the Mandan courthouse and jail, because I would have to turn myself in a few hours later. It was 7 in the morning. We always broadcast at 8 Eastern time, 7 North Dakota time. We had to shine spotlights on the courthouse and the jail, and in between them on the property is the 10 Commandments. And we thought we'd use this opportunity to highlight what was going on. We interviewed Dave Archambault, the chair of the Standing Rock Sioux, and I asked him about whether he was arrested. He had been. He's the chair of the Standing Rock Sioux, like the president of the United States, charged with a low-level misdemeanor. And what happened? He was strip searched, he was put in an orange jumpsuit, and he was jailed. And then there was Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, the physician, the pediatrician of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. She engaged in civil disobedience. She cared about the health of the children of the tribe. She was strip searched. She was put in an orange jumpsuit. She was jailed. The humiliation never stopped. And we did this broadcast, and now international journalists were paying attention. The New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Vogue magazine, BBC, Al Jazeera, all the national and international networks were shining a spotlight because a journalist was facing arrest. And in the process, hundreds of people came to show solidarity right there at the courthouse after the broadcast. And Native Americans who were going to court that day, charged with felonies or misdemeanors, a number of them had their charges dropped as well. This is what it means when the spotlight shines in the right direction. A judge had to sign off on the charges before the arraignment, and because of this massive amount of attention, he refused to sign off. And that was the end of our case. but it wasn't the end of what's happening with the Standing Rock Sioux. In December 5th, President Obama, coordinated from the White House through these 3 agencies, issued another letter that said that they were not going to move forward with the pipeline at that point. They would look into rerouting or perhaps not allowing this at all. It was a moment of great exhilaration, confusion for the Native Americans. Could this be possibly true? But then exhilaration. They had won. And then President Trump came into office, and one of his first acts in office was to issue the permit for the building of the pipeline under the Missouri River, and to say that the Keystone XL pipeline would be revived. But the struggle is not over. It is amazing to see across the country people standing in front of Wells Fargo banks and Banks of America. Now the institutions that fund these pipelines, the Standing Rock Sioux, see this way beyond this particular pipeline, going to the whole fossil fuel industry and the way we live our lives, once again teaching all of us. And this is absolutely critically important, and we need a media that is not brought to us by these financial institutions and the oil and gas companies that profit from the desecration of this land and water. And I'll just end with this. At the March for Science, as I said at the beginning, there were these pins that said, "Science, not silence." So let's go back to World War II. To a brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl, who together with their professor and some other students and workers, they were not Jewish, they were German Christians, but they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? And they decided they could put out information so that the Germans would never be able to say we didn't know. And they put out a series of 6 pamphlets, and on one of them were written the words, "We will not be silent." They distributed these everywhere, in alleyways, in schoolyards, in marketplaces under cover of darkness. And then they were caught by the Nazis. Hans and Sophie, their professor. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy Now!